Hello, gentlemen. So we're here today at Parallax to celebrate O.G. Rowe's course, which is coming up in November, and which is going to be smashing. Do you want to start by telling us about this course? Yeah, I understand it has something to do with birds floating in the air.
Yeah, it's a bird watching class. We're going to get through the expertise of how to watch it, cardinals and bluebirds and different things. So it's all going to work out. But anyway, it's wonderful to be here, Cadell, Andrew. Always a pleasure to speak. I think it's really important that we can think of the great thinker Ivan Illich, who I am just always amazed by, on this distinction that's kind of central to the class between planning and being prepared. And it's increasingly important, I think, to be prepared for the unexpected than to plan to make sure that the unexpected never occurs. Because you're ultimately going to be very fragile if you're always planning, because you can't plan for everything. But if you're prepared, like we talked before, Andrew, on the hip hop cipher, you don't know what's going to happen in the cipher. But when you step into it, if you've done the work, if you've done the thinking, you're prepared for whatever can occur. And then you can make some magic occur. That is the hip hop. That is the unexpected. That is what can go forth. This is a very good model by which to live life. To live life in a manner where you're prepared for whatever life throws at you. It would change how you do education. It would change how you do relationships. It would change how you do work. It would have radical ramifications in all of these different areas. And I think it would be very positive and would help make us more human instead of disabled, as Ivan Illich will talk about. The title of the course is based on Matthew 6, where Jesus is like, look at the birds of the air. They neither store nor weep nor store up in barns, and they're taken care of. And there's this kind of idea that if you seek what really matters, if you put forth what really matters and you prepare yourself and raise yourself up to that, that's the way to be fully human. But ironically, very often today, in the name of making sure nothing goes wrong, we set ourselves up to be too fragile and too incapable of being able to handle or respond to the things that don't go as we expect or that goes wrong. And by actually kind of flipping it a little bit and thinking more through the lens of Ivan Illich, we might be able to be a lot more human than we otherwise tend to end up.
Mm. Okay, so you guys work together at Philosophy Portal, and that sounds coherent with perhaps with Cadell's mission, um, in some ways. And so, Cadell, are you familiar with the work of Ivan Illich at all? And do you have any thoughts about what OG's putting forth here?
Well, I guess like a well-prepared bird, I I've read a lot of philosophy. I've read a lot of this and that, but I've never encountered Illich, but I'm at the same time feeling like I'm ready to encounter whatever is thrown at me, and I can dance around and make some magic happen.
Uh-huh. Okay. So what do you think of this idea, like about planning and just encountering life? Because I guess maybe I could just say something about Ivan Illich. He's a uh, philosopher who was very big in the 60s and 70s, and he was kind of like a radical figure in some way because he was critiquing most of the institutions, and he got kind of picked up by the radicals of the day, and then kind of got canceled in the 80s because of his book Gender, and disappeared from public discourse because he felt that public discourse was no longer worth engaging with, I would say. But so there's two parts of his work. There's his public work, and then there's his later work, which I find deeper and even more interesting than his earlier work, even though he's an unknown figure in many ways. I think he has a lot of influence. A lot of people who I've talked to, we put on a course with Bonita Roy, and I've talked to Jordan Hall, and there's a lot of people mention him here and there, and that he's had a big effect on them, and he's definitely had a big effect on me since reading him. And I think what we can find in him is a prophet even though he would object to that term, a prophet of what is happening in the age of systems, what he called the age of systems.
Well, I can relate to this. Let me relate to this idea of planning. If that does that make the most sense as an inroad?
Sure, please.
All right, so this is the way I would approach the first thoughts that come to my mind when I hear or I read about the upcoming course, and specifically this notion of unplanning our lives. So for me, when I was really getting into academics, when I was getting into moving in that direction, it actually came out of a disruption of a plan. So the plan was to become a world famous athlete. As you can see, I failed. So it didn't work out so well. At a certain point, basically, you have a plan. I think it's good to have a plan. You know, I had a plan, live out a plan, and you reach the limit of the plan, and then you find yourself in this disrupted space. And then what do you do with that disruptive space? Well, at that time in my life, I came up with another plan. I was going to go into academia, and I came up with another plan, and there's another scaffolding there, right? And I sort of live out that plan, you know, and the plan is something, that I think many people, especially in the 20th century, will be familiar with, is that you go undergrad, you go to graduate school, you go to do a doctorate, or you do undergrad and then you get a career, and then that career is going to take you until retirement, right? And that's the plan, right? And the problem in the 21st century, and maybe why O.G. Rose's course is so important, sign up right now, is that these life plans of I'm going to be X, I'm going to be a professor until I'm 60 and then retire, or I'm going to be a doctor until I'm 60 and then retire, or I had a girlfriend in my undergrad who wanted me to become a doctor. Her parents said, unless you're a doctor, you can't date my daughter, right? So there's these ways in which people base their entire family structures on these plans. Right? Like, you have to become this, and then you have this job until you retire. And the thing is that model's just broken completely. Like, that doesn't work at all. Like, and for me, I had an interesting window into this because I was interested in the technological singularity theory, where I saw that as technology was advancing through society, I was like, all of the ways in which our society organizes plans for a life, they're not going to hold. So, for example, if you look at papers, there are papers that say by 2030, we're not going to need lawyers. By 2030, we're not going to need doctors. By 2030, we might not need teachers, right? And then all of the things in which people organize and plan their lives just become disrupted. So, in some sense, if you are within one of these plans, then it could very well be that this plan is going to encounter an imminent disruption, and you need to unplan in order to, in some sense, come up with a different ethic of life. And maybe what O.G. Rose is trying to do here could be a helpful window or a gateway into that type of experience of life.
Yeah, just before O.G. speaks, I just want to say that what you're describing is really that's how you know, Ivan Illich lived his life, right, through various disruptions of one world into the other and leaving another world behind. So that's very interesting, and I think he believed, you know, as a religious person, that he was guided by, you know, what you could call the Holy Spirit. So when the system becomes so reified and so mechanical and so dead, there's a need to move into another realm, and it means, you know, leaving everything behind. So I think that's what you've been describing a little bit, Cadell.
Well, I'll just say that I came up on the, and then pass it to Daniel, but I came up in terms of the end of my plan when basically the first was at the end of my master's, I realized that the plan I had structured in the academic university system was in too much of a conflict with the real of my desire. And so and then when I was able to get into a doctoral program which was in touch with the real of my desire, I came up in terms of the hard limitations of basically I don't think the university system is going to hold the way it currently exists, and so that was another break point. And so I think in regards to what you're saying about the way Ivan Illich lived his life, sort of incorporating like that to me is like, you know, for example, if we're going to throw in jargon, like the idea of self-othering, of living as a self-othering process, that what that means basically is to incorporate disruption and to make yourself in some sense capable of making disruption your friend. And then if you can make disruption your friend, and then you're able to in some sense move with the asymmetry of your identity instead of the constantly needing to fortify the symmetry of your identity. And maybe I'll end it there.
Both of what you said was perfect. And it's very important to note that planning is inevitable. Like, so for example, I've got to go unfold chairs at the venue. I'm planning to go unfold chairs at the venue. I've got a schedule and so on and so forth. The issue is order. And where today what we tend to do is plan and not prepare. Like we think if we're planned, we are prepared, but they're actually different activities and they're different ways of being ready for the world. You know, St. Augustine had that idea that evil is a misordered good. You know, everything that exists has substance if rightly ordered. So likewise, if we plan to say, go unfold the chairs at the venue without sacrificing the exercises or work to be prepared for the unexpected, that would be one thing. But there's something about the systems that Ivan Illich talks about, the human brain in general, that tends to go in the direction of treating the only real things as the things that are planned. And if you do that, that's you being responsible and that's you doing what you need to do. But ironically, that actually makes you unprepared for the unexpected in life. You know, a way to put it to use, because Cadell is teaching on Lacan, which is extraordinary. Cadell always loves to do classes on the most difficult books and thinkers. So salute you, sir. And with like Lacan, what we've done is we've tried to plan away from encountering the real. And we've been able to do that for a while. Now we actually need to prepare for the real. Like you have to be prepared for the real, especially given the singularity or AI and all the changes that are occurring. If we're not, the psychosis and neurosis that will occur is going to be extraordinary. And you see that increasingly occurring. Another way to frame this is Nassim Taleb and anti-fragile, because basically to be prepared is to be anti-fragile. And the problem with planning is that it makes you fragile. You cannot predict when the rock is going to hit the window, for example. It could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be later. But you could, looking at the structure of the window, determine if it would handle being hit by a rock or if it would shatter, right? So by examining the structure and the anti-fragility or robustness, these different terms that Taleb uses, you would say, oh, well, even though I don't know when something unexpected will occur, say a rock hits the window, I have reason to believe the window will be fine because of its structure. This is what has occurred. We've basically focused all our attention on planning to make sure that the rock never hits the window, which is ultimately impossible, not paid attention to the structure of the window, which would be preparing for the day the unexpected occurs. And as a result, when our planning fails and the rock eventually hits the window, it shatters. And that just describes us, because we need to be thinking in terms of, but this is where Ivan Illich is also very important in his later work, where he talks about shadow work, the right of useful unemployment, because basically what he's pointing out is all of the things that make us prepared and anti-fragile tend to occur in the shadows of the system. It's the work that you're not paid for. It's the work outside of employment. That is what makes you anti-fragile. And if you exist in a society where doing that work makes you a deviant, quote unquote is the term he uses, or immoral or irrational, then it becomes rational for people to only engage in planning, to only participate in the system, to therefore become fragile. And then when the unexpected occurs, the singularity is, as Cadell mentioned, then everyone's going to shatter. And that's basically what's being set up now. And then the irony too, and then I'll pass it on, is I've been doing a lot on like economics and theories of equilibrium, and Tyler Cohn talks about the great stagnation. The great irony is this emphasis on planning seems to eventually lead to a great stagnation in first world nations. It stops creating wealth. Because ironically, it would seem that economies ultimately rely on that shadow work area where creativity and wealth occurrence happens, which is outside the economy. So then the other irony is if everyone's like, well, planning is practical, from an economic standpoint, if the emphasis on planning removes wealth creation, it's actually incredibly unpractical and unbeneficial to the system, because it creates a people that actually aren't even able to engage in creativity, wealth creation, social capital, all these things. And yet we're sacrificing this wealth in the name of wealth through planning. So this is the great irony that is occurring, and why a focus on preparing becomes really, really urgent today, both in just being more human, but then on a structural level, on a kind of macro system level as well. We're not seeing wealth creation. And so you're just seeing that the emphasis on planning has a limit to what it's capable of producing.
Yeah, for some reason when you were speaking, I'm picturing what's going on in Israel right now in a way, and I'm picturing these people living in these beautiful houses and somewhere in Israel, and then, you know, terrorists paragliding through the, you know, into their world, and them having to be faced with death, you know, these images. So it's like I was thinking about Ivan Illich and how, in a way, he wants us to prepare for death, not to plan for death, but that is sort of the deepest kind of preparation or deepest kind of spiritual practice that could be done, because no matter what we try to plan for, there's always that possibility of the boundaries and borders, you know, being thrown open and us being encountering that.
I mean, I think that's a fantastic point. My mind and heart have been mostly there actually the last few days. Not in any sort of political I don't know, not in any ideological sense, but mostly in the real sense of like just confronting the real of those stories. Like, so for example, the people who planned to go to a festival, the people who planned to go to dance, and the people who plan to go listen to some techno music, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in a war zone, which nobody could have planned for. I suppose you could argue that you could live your life in such a way as that you could prepare for the imminent catastrophe of any given event. But ultimately, I think the best framing, and the framing that has stayed with me since I sort of started my journey outside of the academy, was Die Again, Die Better. And the reason why Die Again, Die Better became sort of so central to me was because it seemed to me that facing death, and living and preparing my life in some sense in relationship to death, is the deepest work that can be done.
I think Illich would agree with that, and I think that is. I'm sorry if I interrupted there, but it just really resonates with Illich's idea that actually the hospitals and, you know, hospitals are robbing people of their, you know, ability to die, you know, in a sense, and then schools are robbing their people of their ability to become sentient thinking people. And this was his point, you know, which seemed rather extreme when he came out with it, but it seems to be becoming more and more the case, you know, in the very institutions that people are, you know, people which are, you know, which people are dealing with these things.
Yeah, well, I think what has occurred is we have an extraordinary bias toward what is quantifiable. And if it is not quantifiable, then it doesn't exist. It's not even real. And Julia Benda, when he wrote, and I read that with Joshua Hansen, who recently put out a lovely new book on academia, Joshua Hansen and Raymond do just wonderful, Owen do wonderful work. And what Julia was warning back in the 1920s, quite a bit ago, is he's saying that the university system is giving up or absconding its duty to defend the useless space, the space of leisure. And he's like, if that occurs, then there will only be spaces that are validated by what is quote unquote practical according to pragmatism, as understood at the time. And that would result in a massive dehumanization. And it would also make people dependent on the system because it would only, their value would only be tied to their ability to effectively participate in that system. So there would be a disabling of humanity. And you know, then you had people like Joseph Piper, obviously, and different people. And Ivan Illich is right in there. And so likewise, what ends up happening is health becomes like, in a way, education becomes good at tests. Health becomes taking medicine. Being practical is knowing which experts to refer to. There's this gradual shift in associations of which increasingly disable the human being from being capable of thinking about health on their own or thinking through their own ideas. Or all of these different things. And so you're increasingly disabled. And the insidious part about it is you actually feel like you're not disabled, though, because I can call the expert, because I can take the medicine. So the fact you've been disabled is actually hidden from you by the presence of the system until it's too late, until the unexpected occurs, or you can't access it. And it actually then brings, of course, to mind kind of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where the master actually doesn't have you think you're the master because you have access to all of these things and the system serves you. But actually, no, the system has all the power because you don't have any ability outside the system. And so there's an alienation that occurs. And I absolutely think we really need to examine when people today are talking about the kind of mental health crisis, meaning crisis, all these terms, we really need to examine how much of it is a disablement crisis, a feeling of I don't have skills, I don't have abilities, I can't live the life I want to, and I'm kind of disempowered. Because I think that's a big feeling that people have. But, you know, as Illich points out, if you take the time to say, learn how to build, the example he uses in his book is learning to build a house on your own without reference to a professional, people look at you like you're crazy. Why would you build a house yourself when you can have some people come and do it for you? It's irrational. It's impractical. And what Illich says is that basically means any skill. That basically means that any skill production of a human being outside of their job is going to be there's not going to be incentive to do it. And in fact, it will seem rational not to do it. Well, that just means everyone's disabled. That just means everyone doesn't have abilities and skills. And that leads to a feeling of disempowerment that I think is widespread today.
Yeah, this was his term, the disabling professions, which appear to give you some sort of power because you have this profession, right, which gives you a social status in the world, which and it might make you feel good for a while, but then you realize that you're not connecting with so many aspects of life, you know, and then you have this whole burnout society or whatever, because people are just working on one level. They're not, you know, relating to all the different levels of existence, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I came unplanned to this talk, but I also came to this talk with a feeling of the level of impotence we're facing, or the level of impotence that I think exists in the general population. I mean, on one level, I think I could frame this level of impotence we're feeling and facing in a positive way, and also in a symptomatic way of the need for this course, in the sense that, in my experience, if you need to unplan your life, it means there's something seriously wrong with your plan, right? Like if you're operating within a plan which is really not working, that's been my experience anyway. Like, you know, when you reach the limit of a plan, And that's at the moment where you need to sort of enter the phase of unplanning. And you sort of need to demechanize whatever it is that has been installed in you, either through organizational, institutional lens, or through even can be from familial or your socio-relational life that's not working, that something's deeply wrong. In terms of the positive dimension to entering into this space of unplanning and impotence being a positive thing, is that you can, in some sense, sort of, it's painful, but you can confront and wash out of yourself the images of omnipotence that might be operating inside of you, and actually confronting the dimension where you feel most weak and most impotent is actually where you could perhaps find, I don't know, the word grace comes to mind. The capacity to humble yourself to the reality of what's really going on, and whatever fantasies may have been obscuring or masking the relationship to the real of your own body and your own immediate social relationships. So in that sense, but I also don't want to make it too personalized, in the sense of like, okay, it's easy at this point in time to jump on Jordan Peterson, but the whole clean your room mentality is also, to me, very limited in terms of personalizing it too much, because I think we should have a deep sympathy and respect for anyone who might want to take this course, on the level of it is incredibly disorienting to know what to do with your life today. Like when you and maybe I've had the advantage of thinking about these things since I was in my teenage years, because I came on the Singularity. But like, really, if you're in a situation where all of the major professions are not going to be needed, where all of the major career opportunity, and you've been trained in a school since kindergarten to think in this way, then what are you supposed to do except cry and break down at the reality of the situation? I mean, probably the best response is to break down and cry, and I mean, that's something that I've done several times. But the point is that you have to, in some sense, befriend that level of disorientation. That's why I've sort of liked Alenka Zupancic's idea of object disoriented ontology, is that we have to become disoriented. And we have to befriend disorientation in order to even start to glimmer at maybe the next steps. And I think in terms of the next steps, you have to stay very, very humble in terms of capacity to predict. So let me just give one example, and then I'll shut up. Is when I was in the institutions, I could plan out my life many years in advance. And I think in the 20th century, many people could do that. They could plan out their life. You could plan your life. And to be honest, that makes it, in some sense, a lot easier to engage in family building activities, because when you have kids and you have family, you want to be able to provide. You don't want to be like, I don't know when I'm going to get a check next week. I don't know if I'm going to be able to put food on the table next week. You want to be able to have that prediction horizon. But the point is, I think today, is that people don't so for me, moving out of the institutions, every year I've been building Philosophy Portal, I don't know what I'm going to be doing the next year. I don't know what I'm going to be doing the next year, because I can't know what I'm going to be doing the next year, because everything changes so quickly. I think the techno-capitalist environment that we're operating in is so pathological, and there's so much mimetic competition and rivalry, and there's so many informal boundaries and so much complex social interactions. You can't plan anything. So you have to, in some sense, befriend this disorientation, and you got to constantly go back to it, and it's hard to endure that. And so in some sense, I hope what people might get for O.G. Rose's course is not only the capacity to befriend this disorientation, but the capacity to endure through this disorientation, not knowing what's going to come out on the other side.
It's interesting. It's a dialectic to the Jordan Peterson thing, which is all about planning, right? Cleaning your room, planning, and you're saying unplanned. So that's a very interesting counterpoint to that in a way. Not that there isn't something true about like cleaning your room in the sense of sort of, it depends what you consider your room, cleaning your environment so that you can function and become, you know, more human and not be blown around by the winds of everything. But on the other hand, that's not a full picture. It's not a full picture, because I think that what you're describing, Cadell, is closer to life, where there is no planning, where you're just confronted with life in every moment. I mean, rather than you're stuck in your plan, which becomes very mechanical if you're not, you know, really living a life at the same time.
I just say very quickly one more thing before Daniel jumps in. Yes, 100% life, but also I want to emphasize techno-capital, because and how strange this environment is that we're entering. You know, it's not like, and this is where like if it was just life, then we could in some sense go, and this is, I think, where the truth of the traditionalist impulse comes from. Is the traditionalist impulse is, let's go back to before modern world, let's go back to before the industrial world, I'm not saying, yeah, we should learn the skills of building your own house and so forth, farming and all of those things, but the thing is that we are entering such a strange world because of technology and because of automation and because of like, let's not forget, like any other paradigm, politically speaking, other than capital, has basically been eliminated. There's a capitalist hegemony on a global level. So in that sense, you're in some sense thrust into the market forces. So in this is very, very, very strange place to be. So life, also techno capital. This is and it's in some sense we should think ecologically, because techno capitalism is an ecology of its own.
Mm-hmm.
That everything that's been said is extremely important. On the Jordan Peterson example, there's two ways to look at it. There's make your bed every morning, which is develop the skill to be someone who's able to organize a space, stay disciplined, and remember something, which is valuable because you're developing a kind of skill. But then there's another side of it that is kind of, oh, I plan to start my day making my bed. And you're not really thinking of it in terms of developing skills that you take beyond the bedroom. That's the question. One person could be cleaning their room, making their bed in just a planned way. Another person could be doing it in a skilled ways. And that's going to come to these kind of self-discernments that we need to look at. A few more things. Everything that was said was exactly right. We have to, if our plans are deeply wrong and causing trouble, we need to unplan ourselves. And basically AI and techno-capitalism is going to make sure that basically all our plans are such, because if you can plan it, AI can do it better. Like almost by definition, like AI is always going to be a better planner than the human being. So anything that we can plan to accomplish, AI will do it, basically. And what's going to happen is that AI and technology is going to push human beings more and more to the shadow work realm, the realm that is kind of apathetic, that you have to do to know, decipher these things that are not plannable, because if they're plannable, AI is going to be doing it. And so those kind of skills are going to be a big deal. And certainly I'm not going to not hire someone to help me fix my house or do these different things. But what Ivan Illich is bringing into our attention is that there's a trade-off. It's just like Neil Postman that's saying, he's not saying never watch TV, but he wants us to realize that it's always a Faustian bargain. If you choose to watch TV, that's going to maybe remove the imperative to learn how to tell stories or how to engage in conversation. There's always a risk. So it goes whenever you rely on technology or professionalism. That doesn't mean it's inherently bad. It's contingent. It's contingent on your awareness. And that's why Illich then stresses awareness, and then Simone Weil, and like it's based on your awareness of the trade-off. And if that's a trade-off you want to make, and if you make that trade-off, what are you filling the void with? If you don't have the ability to, say, build your house, what skills and abilities do you have? Do you have any? Or are they all captured by the system? Because if they're captured by the system, and your entire empowerment is contingent upon that system, well, then if the system kicks you out, as techno-capitalism likely will, you're in trouble because you won't have anything. And the last thing I'll say to it as well, I really want to tap on the point that Cadell made about families. You know, a lot of people are like, oh, people aren't getting married because they don't want to have kids or start families. Well, they don't know how to plan. Like you get like if you go up to the girl and you're like, hey, I'd like to marry your daughter. And he's like, well, what's your 10-year plan? You're done. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you can't start, like, we really have to examine the demographic crisis as partly to some degree a result of the bias for planning against preparing, the bias against shadow work, the need to know what's going to occur, because that's not on the table. And if people are basically not allowed to start families, or, you know, are not going to get permission, or they're going to like be nervous, or they themselves are a nervous wreck to themselves because they don't know how they're going to take care of a family because they can't have a plan, well, then it's not going to occur. And I think that, you know, the Collins talk about the collapsing birth rates. I know Cadell had that wonderful talk with Malcolm and Simone. That's a big part of this issue. And that, but so then to shift that, and then I'll pass it on. Right now, all of the ethics are you're responsible if you have a plan. Under that, in this new paradigm, people aren't going to have families because they're not going to feel responsible. They're not going to feel capable for the future. But if instead being responsible is being prepared, having the ability to meet whatever occurs, having the ability to improvise, having the ability to make things work, well, then people could maybe feel ready and prepared and start families and things. But you have to have a kind of ethical shift in the zeitgeist in order to make that change.
Could I suggest, and of course just dismiss the suggestion if it's not relevant, but it could be that we need a dialectic of planning and unplanning.
Oh, sure, sure.
Like it seems like I totally get the unplanning your life thing. I totally get it. I think it's needed. But what's coming out the most, like coming into this conversation, I was unplanned. Now in this conversation, what's sticking out to me as very important and very central for people who will be taking this course is being prepared. That's and like, because that to me is just, you know, it's hitting the mark. It's hitting the mark of I'm just, anyway, but I just think that also maybe
it's interesting
to elaborate just for one moment. I just want to elaborate very quickly on how important it is, this people not getting married and having kids because you cannot have a 10-year plan. So like, for example, when I had again, I give that story of my second girlfriend. Literally I needed a life plan. Right. I needed a life plan. I needed to be a guaranteed to make this much income, guaranteed to be this profession. And the whole life had to be totally guaranteed and locked up, right? With no room for uncertainty, or else the relationship could not move forward. Now, in terms of what that is defending against, that's defending against the inherent anxiety of uncertainty, the inherent anxiety of how it's hard enough to live with oneself, then to have a long-term relationship partner. Many people are extremely struggling with this. Then in terms of having a long-term relationship partner and having kids, taking care of impotent bodies, because what does it mean to have kids? It's basically taking care of impotent bodies, and having the anxiety of not feeling like an adult yourself, having to raise other impotent bodies to be adults is most. If people don't have the knowledge of how they're going to put food on the table or pay rent, they're not going to be able to enter into those types of arrangements. There's going to be too much anxiety. And so basically the social fabric of our society is being ripped apart by the anxiety of uncertainty and the fact that planning is just not possible anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Cadell, as you were speaking, I was thinking of a conversation we had in Berlin where, you know, where you were talking about your future, and I was saying, well, I just got married and had kids. I didn't really think about it. But in a way, it's something that what Daniel is saying, I think I felt prepared, even though I had no plan. like I had zero plan, but in some way I was prepared because I'd had bad relationships and I knew what they were, and I knew what a good relationship was, and I had trust in this person. So I didn't have a plan, and I didn't have much of an income, and I didn't have any clear future whatsoever. But this is a very good thing that Daniel is saying. Being prepared is very, it's very different, right? Than sort of having a clear map. I mean, I think it's good maybe to have a map, but you have to know that you're going to have to change, on a dime, in a million ways, and it's not gonna, your image of whatever you think you can be and who you're going to be is never going to be conformed with your plan ever, right? So that's very interesting.
Well, I think to me it's dialectical in some sense, because I think, like, for example, when I had the image of myself of doing a doctorate at 19, I did have the image of doing a doctorate on the singularity, and I had the image of collaborating with certain people, and that did come to be. So in some sense, having a goal and aiming for it can be good. But at the same time, I think what you're emphasizing, Sweeney, is so important, is that whatever map you have has to be something that changes, and has to be something that responds to the real of the situation. It's never going to be mapping the entire field of your experience. So there's some sort of dialectic here at work. And I think we should use the example of marriage and children and building a house as a case example, where we can actually work out the nuts and bolts of what we mean when we say plan, unplan, be prepared, all of these things.
No, everything was perfect. And Sweeney, that's a perfect example, because I think that gets at it, and what Cadell said gets at it as well. The issue is that, this is the part where Michelle has this wonderful metaphor of the bird. And if you see this, there's a difference between having a bird that you hold by the feet and you've captured it, versus holding the bird in the palm of your hand. It can fly off, but you trust that it's going to come back because you've prepared and you've trained the bird. And so likewise, if we hold plans like this, that's one thing. But there's something about human beings that can't help but grip plans and make the map equal to territory. And that's when all the problems begin. So from a place of preparation, plans can come out. Like like I said, I'm planning to go fix these chairs or different things. The issue is when we put plans first, it doesn't tend to be the case that being prepared comes out of that, because there's something about prioritizing plans as primary that makes us fragile and not doing the work of prepared, because it feels like we are prepared. Whereas when you're prepared and you let the plans come out, and the other key is when you're focus primarily on being prepared, your plans tend to have a smaller window. Like you're planning for next week or 2 weeks, as opposed to 10 years from now. Because it's just like in a weather forecast, the likelihood of the forecast being accurate if it's a month out is quite low. But if it's for tomorrow, it's probably pretty high, right? So the effectiveness of planning tends to collapse the more outward it is, and the more long-term it is, the only way really to be, dare I say, practical, like actually practical, is to be prepared, because you can't predict that far out. So the problem is, what we've done is gotten the order backwards. We're emphasizing plans, and as a result, not being prepared. It's like, the thing with C.S. Lewis I love so much. If you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. Planning is a second thing. We've made it a first thing, so our plans don't even work, and we're not prepared. But if we made being prepared primary, well, then we would have plans that would actually be effective, because for wherever the map isn't the territory, we're prepared for that break. That's the thing. Like, if you're prepared, then wherever the plan fails, you're ready for that. You knew it was just a map. You knew it wasn't the territory. You knew it was just a model, and now you're able to fill it out. But if you're not prepared, here's what happens. If you're not prepared, and you've had this plan, because plans tend to have a kind of Stockholm syndrome thing. You tend to fall in love with them. They tend to like you get attached to them. When they fail, you are straight devastated, and you have no idea what to do, and everything collapses. And so then here's the thing. Okay, so your plan failed, but all you know how to do is make plans. And so you go back to your room, you're devastated. Well, how do you leave your room if you're devastated and you haven't made your bed? Well, all you know how to do is make another plan. But why would you do that if the first one failed? And eventually you just stop trying because you don't know of any other alternatives. And that's where you end up in this disabled ethos that that Illich is pointing at. Like, when plans fail, as they will, if all anyone knows how to do is make another plan, they'll eventually stop. And then they won't get married. Then they won't have kids. Then they won't move into the future.
I think I just want to situate this in regards to not the end of the scientific universe, but the end of the scientific universe that doesn't include subjectivity. So when the scientific universe was born, it was born under a paradigm of determinism and prediction. Actually, if you go back to the original origin of modern science, what actually gave science its social prestige and its social value in some sense was even the capacity to predict when a comet was going to fly across the sky at a certain moment. Like, this wowed people. The fact that science could predict exactly when a comet was going to cross the sky, and the predictions were much more effective than the people reading tea leaves and stuff like this. They're like, oh, there's something interesting here because science can make predictions. And I think this is the most interesting thing about science, is that, for example, the lower you go in terms of physics, the easier it is to predict things. So, like, for example, when it comes to cosmology, when it comes to astronomy, we can predict the movement of planets billions of years into the future. But the closer you get to the real of human subjectivity, the more our prediction horizon breaks down completely. And this, and then the paradox of science is that all of the prediction capacities of science allow us to do what? It allows us to make technology. But then when you factor in the use of technology on the level of the real of human history, what does that do to human society? It makes it more unpredictable. Meaning we don't, like, in some sense, it's the automatization, it's the technologization of our society, which is making it impossible for us to predict the future of our own identities. So this is, to me, why we have to have a science which includes subjectivity, which is a science which is in some sense much more internal and friendly to the quantum mechanical paradigm, because you come down to uncertainty, you come down into indeterminacy of identity, but also the need for psychoanalysis, because you basically have to, what happens when you confront uncertainty and indeterminacy? You confront anxiety, basically. And it's that anxiety which is going to cause all of the psychological neuroses that people are facing, and it's going to prevent us from being able to live, basically.
But maybe not only anxiety. You meet, like, if I was thinking of translating what you said in Ivan Illich's theology, you meet the Samaritan, right, in the ditch, who is dying or something, or is and you are from a tribe of certainty. This is how you should behave, and you break out of that, let's say, a model of certainty to do this one thing, which breaks out of it, and you meet the Samaritan, and that's, which is like a pure subjective act in a way, it has nothing to do with any of the laws or rules of your society. You've broken that, and for him, that's the profound move, let's say. So I think that's very interesting. I mean, in terms of, I guess, science science makes models of reality, and we become dependent on these models. And then when the models break down, we're faced with, as you say, our own subjectivity, or we're faced with the other. And so we have this very pure decision to make, or something like that, right? This is Ivan Illich, and when we institutionalize that, and when we make it an institution, then we're removing ourselves even further from that pure moment. Is that making any sense? Are you following?
It made sense to me, but I let Daniel, do you want to say?
No, it makes a ton of sense. I think, so a few things. I think the feeling of disgust can be a way to hide from anxiety. Because if you come up on the person on the road and you're disgusted by them, well, then you don't. But if you were to come up on them and say, wait a minute, what if this person is as human as I am? Oh, well, maybe I need to take care of them. And now, like, the anxiety comes with the abyssal, and we create all of these reactions to hide from the abyssal. Because also there's the anxiety of if I take care of this guy on the side of the road, what will my community think of me? Because I would associate with these people. That's why, like, Jesus is such a scandal when he's sitting with tax collectors and different things. But there certainly is many, many emotional responses to accounting the abyssal, if you will, the space of outside of the plan, outside of the system. There is turn to a strongman, like Belonging Again talks about. There's the become a kind of utopianist, where you're not really thinking about, you have this vision of how the world will work and you force it that way. There are all these different responses. And all of them, I think, is speaking to an encounter of Lacan's The Real, which has this kind of anxiety to it. Like, one of the things too, like, there's so much talk about, like, the world is ending. And I wanted to speak on this because I think Cadell is exactly right to say that when you're in this place of impotence where you feel like powerless, it is an opportunity in the Hegelian sense, right? Like, whenever you're encountering a limit, for Alex Ebert, that can be a saturation point that has a threshold, right? So, but it's all up to us. It's like we've said, like, for Hegel, the future is better, but there's no guarantee there's a future. So it's contingent, right? It depends on how we respond to this impotence, and if we might negate it, sublate it into something that actually makes us more human. And actually, the impotence is a result of the saturation of the planning paradigm. It's not that the past was wrong to use planning, because you had a period of technology where that kind of worked, right? Like, the last 70 years, it's not that that was, like, immoral to live according to plans. It worked, right? The issue is that you have historical epochs and shifts, just like Hegel understood. And what you're reaching now is the saturation point of the planning model. And you have to then negate, sublate it into the prepared model. Notice I didn't say erase it, because there's going to be plans in preparing. It's all about the order. It's where we make primary the prepared, and the plans come out of that, as opposed to we've had a historical period where we've basically been able to conflate planning and prepared as if they are the same thing. We've been able to get away with that because the technological paradigm has allowed that, and that's coming to an end. And so now we have to reverse it. And and then I'll pass it on. There's a few, because the things also on the comments was really important. I think you can actually make the argument that, and hopefully Belonging Again too does this, where if you go into economics, you actually see at the core of it is something unplanned. If you go into the core of society, like Belonging Again 1, you see at the core of society something that's unplanned. That is the conflict of society, the value circle. You see in economics, you don't have an equilibrium model. Here's the funny thing: in a very real way, to move to a paradigm that's really focused on the prepared versus the planning is actually bringing out the core of all of these different fields that we've actually kind of lost sight of. Now, that's an elaborate argument I'd have to get at, but another thing I want to just kind of bring out is how there's actually a realization of what's behind so many of our systems, and that's something that's non-systematic that makes it possible. That's an entirely different subject. I just want to note that.
All this seems very profoundly Christian to me. It's like the impetus of the God-man on the cross is our impotence or our inability to plan, right? It's like and what Cadell's talking about, that is the meditation. Okay, we can't, we can't really go further than that somehow.
Well, I would just comment that's a good example, because you can't plan for God to show up as a man like that, right? Like, you can be prepared for it maybe, but even that's a very high bar. I think it's a good example. Cadell, please.
Well, just so again, in the sense of cannot go, like Sweeney was saying, cannot go further than that. It's like, the visions that first came out of scientific determinism were visions of a complete plan. Basically, the complete plan was that we were going to have a complete picture of the deterministic universe, and so in some sense you'd be able to predict everything that could happen into the future. And in some sense that brings us, I think, to the radical core of like what Hegel's saying when he says, and instituting the Owl of Minerva, because he's basically saying, look, you can't jump ahead of yourself. When you include subjectivity, you can't go into the future. You can't predict the future. You can't go any further than this. What we can do is confront the real of our situation here. That's basically what we can do. And what the only thing that the philosopher is the philosopher is actually thinking the real of the moment without and not functioning as a strong man, not focusing as a utopian, not focus. The philosopher doesn't have. The philosopher ideally shouldn't be functioning as just some blind authority figure. The philosopher shouldn't be functioning as some, here's the utopian vision of where we're all going to be going in the promised land. The philosopher is just maybe capable of pointing out some antagonisms and tensions in the present moment that maybe we should think more about. And in some sense, that in some sense might be more closer to the model of preparedness. I mean, a philosopher is ideally someone who's prepared to think the real. That's all. And I think that's why maybe the real blessing or gift that philosophy can give is after you've studied it, you just come to, for example, let's think about like what we can learn from the horrors of what's going on in Israel right now. And let's think about that. I mean, and let's think about that in our deepest humanity together, or something like that, and keep bringing it back to these real topics.
Yeah, I would say that in a way, Gurdjieff's model is you always come back to looking at the self-contraction, looking at the mechanicalness. You keep returning to that and seeing that in yourself. And divesting yourself of all illusion, and then actually something incredibly wonderful arises from that. But you don't want to. But imagining the wonderful thing before you go through that process is probably counterproductive and probably leads to a dangerous idealism.
I completely agree. I think it is profoundly the case that Hegel is preparing. He's talking about preparing, and you can't plan for the future, only prepare for it. And the way you do that is by getting better at confronting the real today. One of the problems with, if you say the point of the world, the point of philosophy is not to interpret the world to change it. The problem is, since you can't interpret the future, all change is regressive. You can only change the world in light of a past model, so it has to be shrinking it. That's the problem. But if you, like Zizek says, if you focus on interpreting the world, well, then you're actually prepared for what the world becomes so that you can meet it in a manner to participate in its negation sublation, as opposed to lead to its regression. It's the first things first principle as well. If you put interpretation first, you get change as well. But if you put change first, you lose both. It's the great irony. And I think also, too, Nietzsche, I'll talk about beastocentrism. Like, basically what we've done is we've had our plans bestow upon us our direction. And so we've been relying on something external from us, a model of the world, to bestow upon us what we should do. And for Nietzsche, no, you have to stop that. You have to deconstruct those beastocentrisms, as I try to outline in book 5 of The Gay Science.
I can jump in here with, so I just finished reading Mark Gerard Murphy's the spiritual direction book on Lacan and John of the Cross. And so coming to the end of that book, he has a really fantastic conclusion. So I want to put that in conversation with plans bestowing direction. For Gerard Murphy, what he's saying is that disruption bestows direction, and grace in that disruption. So grace in disruption bestows direction over plans. In some sense, it's the capacity. And what I take from his idea is that plans must, in some sense, include within themselves the disruption, and then the subjectivity has to, in some sense, be able to endure or hold a graceful position within that condition.
Yeah, I was talking to Tom this morning, about the Israel thing, and you were mentioning, Cadell, this, sometimes you need to weep or sob, and I saw a little video, and it was, family, and there was a boy and a girl, and they were both crying. The parents were there, and then the mother says, Or the kid says, I want my sister back, and the sister's just been shot by the terrorists. And is she coming back? And then the mother says in a very cold voice, because she's trying to keep everything together, no. I just started to sob like for about an hour. And I'm trying to think, what do I do with that? Like, what is the graceful thing to do with that? Do I get into some kind of, righteous state of mind that we should, go and kill all the terrorists, or no, you just have to sit with that and be with that. And that's, there's something, there's a grace in that in a way, because something is something, even though like it's almost sounds pretentious, because you have no idea what that kind of horror is really like in your nice little house in, a southern, but there, the grace you're talking about somehow comes in those moments, doesn't it?
Yes. So this is a really good example, Andrew. It just gave me so many ideas. Like, this is why it's so important to bring these examples from the real, is because it's in examples like that, which that example just captured so perfectly, is that you come to face what the original science couldn't face, which is the irreversibility of process. It's irreversible. She's not coming back.
Yeah.
Original science was always reversibility.
And there's some part of your mind that wants to fix that, and then you can't, and you're stuck there.
You're confronted with impotence.
Abyss. Yeah.
You're confronted with impotence. You're confronted with castration. You can't bring her back, right? And all magical thinking and all woo-woo thinking is basically the capacity to play with reversibility, to undo the horrors of what we've had to endure, and which we cannot just simply endure, because it means confronting the void and putting an image over that unthinkable thing, that unthinkable, that ungrievable thing, which has just happened, and now somehow you have to continue living. After knowing that that's possible, or after knowing that that's something you've had to go through. And I just want to give a very quick example of how this has almost nothing, maybe a little bit, but I don't think very much, to do with intelligence, in just terms of pure intelligence. Mm-hmm. So I listened to a story last week about a man who has purportedly had the highest IQ recorded in the 20th century. He had an IQ of something like 250. He was a prodigal child. He was put on a pedestal from a very young age. People thought he's going to be the next Einstein. There were newspaper reports written that he's going to be Einstein, and all of this stuff. He died in his early 40s working in a patent clerk office. Funny enough, some sort of mail office, with no prestige, whatever, failed at school completely, and whatever. But the interesting thing is he published one paper which nobody read, and it was a theory of time. It was a theory of time which claimed that we could do reversibility. And I read the paper. I read the paper. I'm gonna go read this. And no one apparently gave it any time. It's a hilariously, in some sense, autistic paper. But the point is in the context of what you just said, Sweeney, it proves the point that no matter how intelligent you are, coming to terms with the irreversibility of the universe is too painful. Yeah. It's too, so it doesn't matter that he had a 250 IQ. All he did with his 250 IQ was write a theory about the illusion of reversibility of time.
Yeah, well, there's these stupid people at Harvard who are sort of defending Hamas, defending the terrorists or whatever. They've created some intellectual reason for that, and they're complete morons, no matter how high of an IQ they have. I mean, I don't mean to be political about it at all. It's just moronic, right? There's no humanity there. So it tells me that our education, back to Illich, system is not teaching people to be wise or human or have any depth. For me, it's like that's a religious business in some ways. Maybe it's a philosophical business too, but
well, for me, it's very interesting because I always like to talk about the distinction between correspondence and coherence. And intelligence is in the business of coherence, but it may not correspond with anything. Like there's a good argument to be made that many conspiracies are remarkably intelligent. The problem is they just don't correspond with reality, right? And the problem is that in a society that really emphasizes planning, you're emphasizing coherence as if that equals correspondence. You don't have to actually be prepared for the places where your plans fail. And this is what intelligence wants, actually. Like, intelligence wants to believe that if your model is coherent, or if all your arguments add up, or you have a model and it all fits, that the map is the territory. Because if the map is the territory, then intelligence is God, basically. But if the map isn't the territory, that's really what? Humbling. But in that humility, intelligence can be put in its right space to be enfleshed, as that Illich will say, to be embodied, to be coming to terms with subjectivity and the subject in different things. But this is why, for me, an emphasis on critiquing planning, even though, of course, there are good forms of planning when it is ordered rightly with preparing, is so necessary today, because we have a plan-drunk world. And there's a very real sense, I love these points on the irreversibility. Like, what we're doing in many respects when we create a plan is making sure we never encounter anything that we want to reverse. Like, if everything goes well, we'll never have to want anything reversed. And absolutely intelligence, it's funny to think that at a hyper intelligence, the number one goal is, how can we reverse time? And it goes to show you the actual, like, desire of intelligence is control over time. And maybe then, if time is more primary than space, that a desire over time is the desire to be God, right? Like, because if time is the most fundamental reality, if we have control over time, we're God.
So I just want to say this, because this is my major philosophical takeaway in so far teaching Lacan, is he puts in, he says that in some sense, the sublation of Freud is Plato and Kierkegaard, where Plato is memory and Kierkegaard is repetition. And I was just thinking about the ultimate intelligence has the plan to never encounter anything that we'd want to reverse. This, to me, might be Plato's ideas. This might be Plato's ideas and memory, because Plato puts the ideas on the level of we remember the one. And even my grandmother, I always tell this story. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my grandmother is a super Platonist. And she basically said, oh, you don't remember when we were in heaven before? You don't remember, the before you were born? And she always, anyways, she's classic Platonist in this sense. But what Lacan's saying is, yes, we have this memory, but he also says scientific man is doomed to repetition. And this repetition, and this is why Kierkegaard is such a strange theological figure, because repetition is, in some sense, you're doomed to this absurd, paradoxical situation that Kierkegaard always brings out, right? Like the famous examples being, like, for example, you get married or you don't get married, whatever. All these funny little paradoxes that basically the intellect always wants to reverse to a time where it doesn't have to deal with that doesn't have to deal with that anxiety, basically.
It wants to make everything clean and safe and sterile and have a perfect image, and I think there is something that there's probably an intelligence to that, but as long as you can dissolve, because you have to create images to move forward somehow, but you have to also dissolve the images as well. In the Tantric tradition, we work with images all the time, but we always dissolve them after we work with them so that they don't become fixed pictures of reality. So I think that it might be interesting, like the Platonic and then the absurd and the Platonic have a dialectic together. I think that's what you're saying, right? Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, it's interesting because there's a way in which, the only being that's safe is God, right? And so if we're overly bent on being safe, it's kind of like idolatry, because we're going to make ourselves like God, where we're ultimately safe. And this is where to speak of Christianity for Illich, God, not even God's safe. If you take like a Peter Rollins thing, so who do you think you are, making plans to make sure that nothing bad happens to you? And like, there's an interesting like idolatry, if you're not careful, where safety freezes the world into something predictable. And you see the great irony too on the points that Cadell has made about the comment, like the more complex, and the word complex means a million things to a million people, but if you grant it me here, the more complex we're talking, the less predictable it is. But the irony is that we associate the most real with the most predictable. So the most real things are the least complex. So then humans are like one-dimensional, to use Marcuse's phrase. We're disabled, because if all of the social incentives are in favor of planning and predictability, that means you have to make the human less complex in this sense, to be more like the comet, right? And then we wonder why everyone is like freaking objectified. We objectify ourselves in these social incentives. And so it's so important to not have this association of the real future is the one you can plan, because if you can plan, it's less complex and therefore less alive. It's more like just basic physics or formulas or different things. And so that social bias is incredibly consequential.
Yeah, I could jump in here as well. And just, I like my favorite, my super bias, my favorite theological move is one that always inscribes our own concerns into God himself. So, for example, we're not safe, but God is safe. It's like, no, even God is not safe. This is, to me, when theology becomes fun, because and like, to me, this is like a very practical observation. Let me play with this for a second, that it's not only that we are unsafe, but God is also unsafe. Is that Lacan says, as long as we're speaking, God will exist in some sense. Like, he's basically saying God, he's like equating God to like the symbolic order and speech and the structure of language. And like, he always relates to, for example, we're born into language precedes us. And so in some sense, language is like the structure of God or something. But let me just give this example of even God is not safe in this context, is because what happens with the technological singularity is, in some sense, it threatens language itself. So if God is some sense equivalent to like the symbolic order, even God is unsafe in the technological singularity. So we have to think in this level, I think.
I remember talking to a Jewish theologian who would say that God is schizophrenic, and that it's our job to heal this schizophrenia of God. I thought that was an interesting, another interesting theological kind of game. One thing I was thinking also, I wanted to, what you were talking about earlier, is the fact that this intense planning, right, of the technological world that is encroaching on everybody all the time. I was talking to Owen earlier, and Owen's writing poetry. I say, okay, yeah, that's the thing to do. You're supposed to do the thing that the machine can't do. Always, right? So you should write poetry, or that's the right move to make, to do the thing that the machine cannot do. And that is being prepared. Are you prepared to do what the machine can't do?
I do agree with this, and I like the direction you're pointing. I just want to say that I've come across an AI software program that's able, you can send it like, for example, I'm again giving my bias, but I sent this AI program like Eminem's early albums, and it can play around with them, and it can recreate like the same sounds, and it can recreate the same. So in some sense, even this is under threat. It's basically, this is this is very terrifying. But I agree that this is the question. This is the terrifying question that we need to be prepared for. What we need to be prepared for is precisely what the machine can't do. And I'm even like, I'm paying attention to this in my own work, right? Because in making courses or whatever, writing scientific papers or philosophical papers, increasingly I see all of these advertisements on Twitter or advertisements online that say, oh, in just 5 minutes, this AI program can make an entire course for you. In just 5 minutes, it can create a presentation for you. So you don't ever need to make a presentation, or you don't ever need to create a course, because this AI program can already do it. So it's very disturbing time that we're heading into.
Yeah. So maybe I think we need to wrap up now, because I would love to keep talking for an hour. This has been a wonderful conversation, but I have another appointment at 7. O.G, give us a final plug for why we should unplan our lives.
Well, this has been amazing. We need to unplan our lives. I'll just use what Cadell said at the end. There is going to be something the AI can't do. And we will be so trained by the AI to have it do everything that the thing the AI can't do is what's going to destroy us, because we can't plan for what the AI can't do, only be prepared for it. And that's where we need to be preparing now. So when that thing hits us, we're able to respond to it like a hip hop artist. And I think like life is fuller if you do that. And you really can walk into a room and feel like you can talk to people, that you actually do have something to say to them. And I think the number one thing, so all of this opens up to me, the biggest distinction that is the difficulty of the prepared life, the unplanned life, is being able to tell the difference between fear and wisdom. And I would argue that the whole reason we've actually kind of have this bias toward planning is to conceal ourselves from the difficulty of that discernment. How do you tell when you are engaged in fear to say not do something versus wise to do something? How do you tell when you're being foolish to do something as opposed to facing your fears to do something? This is where all of the different things that come in the class, like these very phenomenological tests, like the unarmored test, self-forgetfulness, all of these have to come out, because that's going to be the fine distinctions we have to engage in auto mastery, get to the place of auto mastery in, so that we can thrive when we have a life that is focused on the prepared as opposed to being disabled by the plan. And that will also be the training that we can put ourselves through to make us ready for this thing that the AI will not be able to do. And that also would actually make us capable. I think Alex would put it very well, where with AI, we're going to have to be escape artists, thinking of entirely new forms of art, because, you know, whatever form we create is going to be really good at poetry suddenly, really good at music. Well, what if there are new forms, like entire forms of art or living that we haven't thought of, that actually AI could help us think of as a tool for that new formulation creation, if we're prepared to face the anxiety that the technology will put forth so that we may use it in that positive way. And so, again, I want to be able to walk into a room and be prepared for whatever the people there may bring or say, and to bring life to that situation, because I know I can't plan for the encounter of the other, but I can be prepared for it. So on November 4th, we will go into detail on how to be prepared, and it will be a lot of fun, and we're thrilled to be starting soon.
Awesome, guys. Thanks so much. This was great, and let's do it again sometime.
Yes, yes, yes. Cadell, Andrew, this has been great.
See you guys.